Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple minutes for attendees to join us, and then we will get started. Well, all right. So welcome, everyone. I'm Tom Walker. I'm the Executive Director at Encore Outpatient Services in Arlington, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar series, DMV Neighbors in Treatment and Recovery, a spotlight on local resources, programs, and expertise. Every week, we look forward to highlighting a different provider in the DMV region to provide you with some insights and resources you can utilize in your practice. Please note that these sessions are not eligible for continuing education credit. We will be conducting these sessions in a webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted. During the presentation, please do utilize the Q&A feature to ask any questions you might have. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. This week, we welcome Erica Cass, who is a clinical social worker in Washington, D.C. Erica's professional background is in working with adults living with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. She is the founder and director of Choices in Healing and Recovery, LLC, which provides CEU training for providers on trauma-informed care and workshops for individuals in recovery. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to your organizations for hosting me today. So I'm going to ask a question. I know I can't see you, but I'm going to invite you to pretend like I can see you and show me how you're feeling today with your face, with your body. So like I'm feeling like this. How are you feeling? I'm pretending I can see you. Is it working? All right, so today I'm going to do a mini version of a 3-hour CEU training that I provide, Trauma Informing the 12 Steps, Empowerment in Substance Misuse and Addiction Recovery. So as we know, the 12 steps have been, a saving grace, a powerful experience for thousands of people all over the world. And I 100% honor the experiences of those for whom the 12 steps have worked and been the right match. And what I focus on in my work is the folks who've fallen through the gaps, those for whom the 12 steps as they are isn't the right match. And for some of those folks, it's because of their histories of trauma. So I imagine that some of you in your work, at least once or twice, have heard from a client that the 12 steps aren't for them. And so as we go through this today, I invite you to think about the clients that you currently work with, clients you've worked with in the past, where what we're talking about seems like it would feel very relevant for those folks. So I'll start briefly just with a quick, what is trauma? And again, there's a much more extensive version in my 3-hour. So the DSM-5 defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation by any of the following ways. Okay, it happens to you. You're driving your car, you have a green light, going this way has a red light, you get closer to the intersection and you see a car and it's not stopping and you have an accident right there in the intersection. It happens to you. There's a woman standing at the bus stop right at the intersection, and she sees the whole thing. She witnesses what you just personally experienced. Your husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, child, roommate gets a phone call from the ER nurse that you've been in an accident. And then the firefighters, the EMTs, the police officers who are exposed to these experiences, you know, day in, day out, repeatedly. And as we know, within this DSM-5, what can follow is trauma, then unhealed, can develop a variety of symptoms that can lead to diagnosis of PTSD. So trauma, you know, can happen throughout the lifespan at any age, we know. Childhood, adolescence, adulthood, as an elder, and it looks different at different times. So we talked about accidents, we talked about car accidents. There can be plane crashes. Someone might be hiking a mountain and have a fall. Natural disasters, tsunamis around the world, hurricanes here in the US. And I think what we most commonly think of in terms of trauma is history of abuse or neglect, emotional, physical, or sexual. And these things look different again at different ages. What neglect looks like for an elderly person is different than what it might look like for a child. Illness, whether it's mental illness or a physical illness, from the point, that moment a person receives a diagnosis, all along the continuum of what happens, can be moments where trauma can be experienced. And then ironically, for folks with mental illness, sometimes the very treatment we're providing, hospitalization, can in and of itself be the trauma, especially when it's an involuntary hospitalization. And of course, the ultimate loss of death of loved ones. And in this COVID time, you know, the thousands that we have lost here and abroad. So these are some of the things that our clients have lived through, you know, as they come to us. You know, we've talked about two different epidemics during this time, two pandemics of coronavirus and racism and police murders of Black people. So all of the oppression, you know, the different experiences that we just talked about of experiences of trauma are experienced through our social identities and the ways that those are conflated. So I speak these words: racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, ageism, religious and spiritual oppression. And these are not mutually exclusive. We're more than one thing in our identities, which comes to intersectional oppression. So all of these experiences are what we're growing up with, and we'll see how they intersect with the use of substances. Many of you may be familiar with the ACEs study. If I could see you, I'd ask for a show of hands. So while we just named lifetime traumatic experiences, you know, happening at any point in the lifespan, the ACEs study was specifically about childhood experiences. And the study involved approximately 17,000 people. It was a partnership between the CDC and Kaiser, so it was all Kaiser patients. Everyone received the same standard medical evaluation, and everyone was asked these same 10 questions. In your childhood, did you ever experience any of these 10 experiences? Emotional, physical, or sexual abuse was the first 3. Emotional or physical neglect. Have someone in the household living with a mental illness, a substance use disorder, or had been incarcerated. And again, we know those things are not mutually exclusive. Witness the domestic violence of a parent, or parental separation or divorce. So now I bring us to the actual 12 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So I want you to think about any time that you've had a client come to you and they felt uncomfortable, angry, some kind of reaction other than welcoming for step 1. And what might that have been about? So I know for me, the clincher has been that word powerless. For survivors of trauma, that word powerless can bring them right back to that event, to feeling like a victim, when what they need and want the most in the world is to feel like they do have some sense of empowerment. Imagine, in some situations, let's say a young woman walks into a room, and, as we know, in 12-step meetings, the steps are in a big poster up there. Someone walks in, and the first thing they see, somebody telling her that she's powerless, she might go running out the door. And when we get into deeper discussions about the steps, of course, I understand the meaning behind it, right? It's about letting go, accepting that there's a problem, but sometimes the language is such an extreme experience for somebody that they're not going to come back to hear that other explanation. And honestly, even if they do come back, it still might be that language is not going to work with them, and that's okay. So I just kept it simple with a reframe on here. Just took the word powerless out. Admitted we were addicted to alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I do want to add that, what I'm offering here, this alternative language, it retains the spiritual part of the 12 steps. And so if I'm working with somebody who is agnostic, atheist, spirituality is not something that's a part of their life, then I wouldn't refer this to them, because I know that's not a good match for them. And I forgot my caveat in the beginning that I, Erica Cass, Choices in Healing and Recovery, we are not affiliated in any way with AA, NA, or any 12-step entity. And if I saw you in person, I would ask you to raise your hand to tell me that you understood that. So, thank you. All right, step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So, sanity, if you're saying I need to be restored to sanity, then that must mean that you think I'm crazy. So for some folks, folks who have co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders, folks living with PTSD symptoms, which can make you feel like you are going crazy, to come in a room and see something that's negatively validating something that they might already be struggling with. This can turn some folks away. So some alternate language: came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could help us to become empowered. Step 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. So one thing I very much like about the 12 steps is the use of the term higher power, which universalizes it. It doesn't make it specific. It has no gender, but it's not used consistently. As you can see here, it's using God instead of higher power, gendered language. And this also comes at the issue of locus of control. Now for some folks, religion, faith, spirituality, the thought of turning one's will over to a higher power, for some folks that can feel very comforting, very healing, like a place to be supported. And for other folks, some trauma survivors, the thought of completely turning over, surrendering, can feel terrifying because that's the very thing that was stolen from them. So we have to understand that one size does not fit all. So some alternate language. Made a decision to let go of our attempts to control and asked, what would my higher power want for me today? And as Tom said, if you have any questions or comments as I'm going, please send them to him, and he'll let me know. Step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So step 4, I think was pretty monumental in terms of my development of this and my coming to know and understand the impacts it was having. So years ago, I had a client who she was dealing with hallucinations. She was dealing with alcohol and drug addiction. She was homeless in a shelter. A lot of things going on at the same time. And in therapy, in terms of trauma work, the only place that we were at, the only place that was safe was really just even knowing how to stay in the room and not dissociate. So we weren't anywhere near getting to the content of her trauma. Even naming it, sometimes she would dissociate. So you see how tenuous and vulnerable of a position. So my whole goal was to work with her to feel safe in the room, to stay safe in her mind, to grounding. And then her sponsor, well-meaning, good person in her own recovery, is sending the message, as often is the program, that the only way to recover is to really get into step 4. You got to get it all out and admit everything and write it all. And for trauma survivors and folks working in trauma therapy, sometimes that's the exact opposite of what they need, because that is a flooding that they are not ready for and could cause to trigger a crisis. So some of what we just talked about, and then adding in the words moral, especially for folks who were raised in what felt like oppressive religious institutions, fearless. Don't be afraid. Just do this thing that could be the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. Searching inventory. You got, like I was saying before, you got to do this. You got to do it all. That's the only way to heal. So some alternate language. Made a list of our behaviors and patterns that have caused us and others harm at a pace that was emotionally safe for us. That part is the key. And I'm aware there are many sponsors, many people in the program who do have an understanding of trauma, from whether it's from their own experience and their own ways of being supported and through it by their own therapists, or by supporting others that that can tweak and do these things. And so again, I want to say that this is not a criticism of the 12 steps. The sole goal is about providing clients resources for what they need for their own recovery journey. So step 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. So some of the topics that we already talked about, inconsistency in the use of the word higher power. The word God with the big G can be very triggering for folks who felt raised in religious oppression and the judgment. So some alternate language. Admitted to our higher power, to ourselves, and to another human being, our list of behaviors and patterns that have caused us and others harms, again, at a pace that was emotionally safe for us. Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Oof, defects of character. I cringe when I hear that, the self-deprecation. I just feel someone just flagellating themselves. And when someone has a history of trauma, specifically a history of abuse where they've been told their whole life that they're defective, that there's something wrong with them, that they're a waste of space, that kind of language really can hit a core nerve and negatively validate a belief system. So some alternate language. Became ready to allow our higher power to guide us in releasing behaviors that no longer serve us. Step 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. So again, a gendered reference to a higher power instead of the neutral higher power. And if we're asking that our shortcomings be removed, does that mean we're not supposed to have any? So I just went in a totally different direction. Humbly asked our higher power to help us accept our human imperfections. So for step 8, to me was pretty neutral because it's an internal process. It's not asking you to share anything with someone else, just a process for yourself. The only switch I made was, you can see on the bottom here, just highlighting that it is an internal process. Made a list of all persons we'd harmed and became willing internally to make amends to them all. Step 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. This is a good start. But what about if it's going to hurt me? So simply adding in would injure them, others, or ourselves. Step 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we're wrong, promptly admitted it. Again, if the word wrong and the judgments from is triggering for someone, you can tweak it a little bit and change it to took responsibility for our mistakes and promptly admitted them. Step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. So a lot of the things that, you know, we have already talked about, as you see here on the screen. So, you know, tweaking, using higher power, and changing to what would my higher power want for me today, and the empowerment to carry that out. And lastly, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So sometimes something may seem very neutral to one person, but very triggering to another. So this statement, carry this message. I know I've used a lot of religious oppression as an example today. For some folks, the feedback of having been raised in a community that was missionaries, or having been raised in a community where missionaries came to them, and that they don't want to be associated with trying to convince others to come in a specific direction. They want there to be more autonomy and choice. So just switched it up a little bit. We tried to share our stories to support others. So that is my alternative language. I want to check in with Tom to see if there's been any questions.
So we have a couple requests for your slides. I think, you know, your rewording and breaking it down is incredibly helpful to incorporate into practice. I have a lot of questions and things I want to talk to you about. So how do you incorporate this? So you know, this trauma-informed way of looking at the steps, so rewording in a time where I think we're all aware that words really matter, and the way we label things and internalize those labels really, really matter. So if you're working with a client, patient, how do you guide them through this? Kind of what's your process here?
Sure. So first of all, it's not something that I just automatically bring up. Because the last thing that I'm trying to do is create a whole new thing and here, follow this, right? No, I'm a resource. It's spread around. So if a client is sharing with me that they're feeling really triggered if they go to an NA meeting, if a client brings to me these concerns that their trauma and the format and the language of the 12 steps is causing them harm, then I will bring up a variety of resources. So something else that in my longer training that I do is I go over a list of alternative peer support groups. And some of y'all I know Encore is familiar with there's some Buddhist ones, there's some secular ones. I have a whole list. So if folks are interested in that, it's also something that I can provide. So it's all based on what the client is presenting to me, what resources that I'm going to offer. So if, let's say then, and hypothetically that they are interested in what I'm talking about, it's a discussion piece. The other thing that's really important is, well, first of all, we know that trauma survivors inherently are in survival mode, and always looking out for danger and wanting to protect themselves. And I also want to vocalize that while they might be excited about this opportunity, you know, their sponsor, their home group, the people in their meetings might not be. So I might not have to say that because they're already, again, like they're survivors. They know not to put themselves in danger. But I think, but you know, in a way that's appropriate to the relationship, appropriate to what you know about their survivor skills, you know, guiding them, because we don't want to set people up for rejection or disappointment. And again, there may be sponsors and other folks in the program that are totally supportive of them utilizing that. And as we know, there's also folks that are very, very tied to the tradition of it, and I respect that. And so, you know, that might not be the best sponsor or meeting for them to explore this. So kind of some guidance that way.
Yeah, and you're bringing up something I wrote down about the subculture within, you know, kind of recovery groups, and you know, the adherence to traditions or a way of doing things. And you know, here at Encore, we have a good percentage of our clients that are emerging adults, and so, you know, very plugged in and very, you know, in that place of, you know, individuating and stating their, you know, what they want purpose, and being different, as well as folks with a lot of history that have been turned off, in part by that subculture or certain aspects of the subculture. Can you speak to that? And you know, Grant, just for the sake, I'm a huge fan of 12 step, and also we provide a number of different paths to recovery as best we can, because there's no one way to truly get clean. So can you speak to navigating that subculture, or navigate like the sponsorship and the fellowship and the, you know, the traditions, if you will?
Sure, absolutely. So I think first and foremost is coming back to that basic human need of feeling a sense of belonging. And when folks have turned to substances to heal the pain of trauma, there's got to be something in there. There's something in there we know about belonging, connection, and a severing in those places. So if we walk into a place that's been talked up as this place where we're going to receive that, and it doesn't feel right, it can be very alienating. I think what's most important is the sharing of resources, is the letting our clients know that there's more than one option. And you know, in the treatment world, not necessarily purposefully, but there's some harm that has been done because for a long time we just didn't know that there were other options in terms of peer support, right? For a long time, like that AA, like that's what it is. It's intertwined into all of society. Any movie you watch about addiction, you always see the person going to a 12-step meeting. In the courts, if someone is mandated to go to, they're mandated to the 12 steps. And so imagine if all of the other peer support groups, and I'm talking about the peer support, right? When you talk about this culture, because actual treatment is different, which is a whole other issue of folks who conflate the 12 steps and treatment, and it's not the same thing.
Let's talk about that in a minute.
Okay. And so can you imagine if you have a client who's court ordered by the judge after a DUI to go, and there's a list of 12 different peer support groups for their alcohol use disorder, and they could choose which one. Can you imagine that? And let's even take it out of a court situation, a mandated situation. Someone who's on their own choosing to come to seek help. They're talking to their therapist, and they're given this list. I really wonder what it would be like if we had like an engagement fair, you know, a resource fair, and someone walked in and could go from table to table. Like, how many more people would get to recovery quicker if they knew there was more than one way?
Yeah, I love that, and I think that the variety makes it easier to accept a way. Um, and for so long, there wasn't a lot of variety, but we're seeing that now. There's a lot more out there. A couple questions came in, and then I want to go back also to what you had just said, because there's a salt. I want to go there. Um, Two questions. One, have you ever had a client who felt pushback or was criticized during an AA group or NA group because he or she changed the steps?
So I want to be transparent that like I do less individual therapy or group therapy. I do workshops for clients. So I don't like the data in terms of we talked about it and then they came back and told me. I'll be speaking to something on a larger issue, but I will answer that question. I hear more about folks who've had experiences before they learned about the resource I'm offering, where when they questioned or shared their discomfort or disagreement, that they received pushback, like, this is how it is, we don't change things, this is the way. And you know, and that's for any of us, it's a terrible experience to share how we're feeling and be told that it's not okay to feel that way. So I want to clarify as well that I am in no way suggesting somebody take this to their 12-step meeting and change the language. I'm not trying to change AA or NA or the 12 steps. It is what it is. And for many people, it's exactly what they need. I'm offering an alternative. It can be a supplement, but I would never go to a 12-step clubhouse and put my stuff up and try to, you know, so it's, um, you know, so I want to be clear about what I'm saying. You know, there are some folks who are in recovery who have a passion, who want to change something from within, and more power to anybody who's doing anything they need to do in their recovery. But I'm not doing that personally.
No, the way I see what you're doing is you're providing a different way of digesting the same principle in a way that kind of circumvents the hot spots. You know,
I like that. Yes.
I like what you're doing. I think it's great. The other question that came in is, you know, what would you advise if someone doesn't want to incorporate a spiritual approach at all?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would 100% say okay. You know, I think it's like it's funny because I remember in the past, you know, just hearing different people, whether it was clients, friends in recovery, just saying stuff like, the God thing is not for me, you know, and the kind of what I was trained with early on in my education, social work education, was like, that means the person is just making an excuse, they're not ready for treatment. For some people, that might be reality. And for other people, they simply may be atheist. And that's okay. So simply saying, okay, I hear you. And sometimes people are so shocked that you're simply accepting their truth that's kind of like, whoa. And that's sad to me that someone would have to feel shocked that they're being listened to. And then I would give them the list of secular resources. Full stop. Smart Recovery is the one that I'm most familiar with. There's also, see, I don't have my list in front of me, so I can't remember them. Secular Organization for Sobriety, SOS, which is mostly online at this point. And then there's like AAagnostica.com, which has a lot of great tools.
Oh, thanks for that. Let's go back. So you said something about conflating the 12 steps in treatment. Will you like expound on that? What do you mean? What's the perspective there?
So peer support groups are wonderful. And the 12 steps in whatever version someone wants to use them is wonderful, but that's different than treatment. The same way that if someone goes to a psychiatric hospital for a week of stabilization and the treatment they're receiving there is different than when they go to a peer support group for depression after they leave. Treatment is evidence-based interventions, clinical interventions by licensed professionals. And peer support groups are a wonderful, wonderful healing tool, but it's non-professional and it's not clinical. Yeah, that I would just keep that simple. It could be much more of an extensive answer, but that's just the basic difference.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to tread lightly here because again, it's important to talk about recovery resources and peer support resources in a treatment setting so that folks are aware, about accessing them outside of treatment. And also what we do as professionals, what we're getting paid to do as professionals, we're utilizing evidence-based practices, and we have a level of training and a set of tools that are far above and beyond, I think, what are available for free in the community. Which leads me into, where you were talking about the 4-step, right? And, I'd like, if you could, to kind of talk a little bit more about why that was, what I heard you say was kind of the catalyst for you to start looking at this and, coming up with trauma-informed 12 steps. What happens with the 4-step in self-help, and what are the implications of that as a professional?
Right. So when there's such a message, so I think some folks in here may be clinicians and in recovery. I'm not sure exactly who's in this Zoom room. Hello, Zoom room. But whatever it is, we're all a part of some type of social group or network. We've all experienced what can happen when there's a message in whatever particular group that we're in, right? It may be an activism group, it may be a school group, it may be our work, it may be recovery. When there's a strong message, and it may start out that we agree with it and we're with it, but then at some point there may be, for lack of a better term, kind of a herd mentality that happens, and it's hard to separate from that. All of us have experienced that to some degree. Oftentimes that happens a lot as an adolescent, and so when there's this, you know what? I forgot your question.
We're talking about the 4-step,
Right.
and
Right.
implications.
Right. And so when there's this big focus on, this is what you need to do, like this is so critical, you gotta get it all out. The only way to recover is to, we're as sick as our secrets, and like all of that. And listen, for some people that may work, it may have worked. And that's fine, but it does not work for everyone. And for folks with trauma histories, severe trauma histories, it can be the thing that actually causes a relapse because there's too much happening and there's not a container for it. Trauma work is so vulnerable and so tenuous, and my recommendation is that it be done with a trained professional. Peer support can be, it means well, but unless both parties are ready for what's coming, it can be a disaster. People can end up back in the hospital. People can relapse. And I'm painting a grim picture here, and it's not always that way, but we have to be careful with trauma. It's really serious.
Yeah, I've been in this field for more than 20 years now, and it's changed a great deal, over the last 2 decades, as it should. We're in healthcare, and healthcare has evolved dramatically in a period of 2 decades. It used to be, if you're in a treatment setting, not talking so much about like a 30-day stay, but your longer term stays, a lot of treatment centers would not allow you to work past a third step, because even with a sponsor, like if you're going to 12 step and you have a sponsor, they didn't want that sponsor taking you into the 4th step while you were in treatment. And now I believe it is, or should be, the opposite of that. That is, it's almost ideal for you to, if you're going to do that work, to do it while you have the professional support, um, in case things unravel, right? And to your point in your slide too, or do it more slowly, right? Take your time with it without the urgency that is applied, so long as the support's in place.
Right.
Would you say that's a reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Jamie Merritt, she wrote the book Trauma and the 12 Steps, which I definitely recommend. And actually, it just came out with a second version. She's a trauma therapist, an EMDR therapist. She talks about what you said, that it's gone from extremes. Like there's been the message of don't don't bring your trauma to substance use recovery. Like, we don't do that. Even though it's what brought someone to addiction, right? um that's not going to help. And the do it all at once and get it out and you got to do it, and that's not going to help. It has to be a balance. It has to be like we're both saying, with the guidance of someone who's a trained clinician.
Right. And I think we've all become so aware for a need to be trauma informed. And I think even moving more towards trauma specific and care, where, you know, we have to acknowledge the substance use disorder more often than not comes with pretty high, high ACEs scores at least, you know. Um, so there's such a need for this. Um, I also appreciate what you brought up about the 9th step, and I do believe in a traditional sponsor-sponsee relationship that making amends, like there's more detail to it than just what you would read, but um, add to that a little bit as well. So, except when to do so would, I forgot your exact words.
Right. So it says, except when to do so would injure yourself. I mean, would injure. Wait, let me go back. Hold on. When to do so would injure them or others. So we say them, others, or ourselves. So let's say, sometimes with a message around, like, looking at my part, right? What is my part? That in general, that can be a helpful way to take responsibility, to own. And in the context of being a survivor of trauma, when there was nothing that was at fault of the person being abused by their stepfather, that's a harmful question. And so it's when something's kind of, when sort of like a cookie cutter approach to how to process something is used when it should not be used in a traumatic situation. So somebody, maybe somebody physically harmed someone who had been abusing them for years. Somebody might interpret this to say, well, you should go make amends to them. And that's not going to be safe for that person. Yeah.
Got it. We had another question come in too. So David's asking, my understanding is that Smart Recovery has both addicted and abusers who are trying to manage their use, continuing to drink and or drug. What is your point of view about integrating these two groups in the same program?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. That are you saying? Wait, can you say that? Read it again.
Says, my understanding is that Smart Recovery has both addicted and abusers who are trying to manage their use, continuing to drink and or drug. What is your point of view about integrating these two groups in the same program?
So I wish I could see you, who the person is, just to make sure I want to make that I'm understanding you. But if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you're saying that there's folks who are still using and coming to the meetings. And so for me, that's everywhere. I mean, there's people in all different stages on the continuum of recovery in any peer support group, in any treatment program. Now, if somebody physically shows up and they're under the influence, that's not okay. But if they come to the group and share, you know what, yesterday I drank, but for 4 days I didn't drink, then that's their journey. I don't know that we can expect that someone to only be not using to be able to come to a support group. But I feel like I might have misunderstood the question.
Yeah, he added, so what he added was abstinence and moderation goals. So it sounds like the question is, you see an issue with like a group where there's folks with those different goals, some for abstinence and some for moderation.
Gotcha. Thanks for that clarity. What I would say is it's really up to each individual who wants to go to their group. There might be some folks who only want to be in a group with people who are working on abstinence. Some people might only want to be in a group where they're working on moderation. And some people might only want to be in a harm reduction group. And some people don't mind the mix. So it's really what is going to work for each person. I don't think there's any right or wrong about which route is taken or mixes of routes. The more choices, the better. Thus the name of my organization, Choices in Healing and Recovery. The more choices, the more chances of finding what's going to work so that people can recover.
Yeah, and I want to, we have a few minutes left. There was one other, it's a comment that came through. I want your reaction to it. And then I want to give you a chance to kind of do another, mention of your work and, and all before we start to close this out. So the comment is, why stop at the 12 steps? Why not create an entirely revised big book that shows more empathy towards those with trauma and towards women who are obviously marginalized in the current text?
Why not? Go for it. I support you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, I think that there's a lot of work to be done and, a lot of, evolution that can occur and millions of ways, as many ways as there are people to interpret recovery and follow that path. So,
yeah.
Very cool. I appreciate everyone jumping in and making comments and asking questions. Erica's information is posted up here on the slide, so she can be reached directly. Erica, do you want to again cover what it is you're doing? Kind of do one last plug for yourself, and then we'll wrap things up.
Sure. And thank you so much to Encore and Caron for this partnership. And thank you all for the questions. So during these Corona times, I've been doing my 3-hour CEU training via Zoom. In my Zoom, we can see each other. This one makes sense. It's a real quick webinar, but for that one, it's 3 hours, so we do see each other. If you work at an agency that is looking for more training, I can always partner to do one specifically for your staff and colleagues. And I also do workshops for folks in recovery. As we know, you might be a clinician and in recovery. It's not mutually exclusive, but the focus is different. For the folks in recovery, it's going over these 12 steps and allowing people to share their experiences of what it's been like for them in meetings, and just have an open, non-judgmental space. Like me on Facebook, and got my contact info. This is great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Erica. It's always great to see you. I always appreciate your perspective on trauma informing the steps, and of course, you've done training for us here at Encore and so forth. So thank you.
Thank you.
For the rest of you, please join us next week, same day and time, as we welcome Alex Ribbentrop from Live Free Psychotherapy to discuss intergenerational trauma, personality disorders, and addiction. The following week, we will host Laura Goldstein from Montgomery County Counseling Center, who will share on the topic of motivating parents to practice validation skills. Registration is now open for these webinars and all of our additional webinars through the end of the month, and some in August will come live as well for registration. In the meantime, please feel free to reach out to myself here at Encore Outpatient, Mallory Schwartzman at Maryland Addiction Recovery Center, as well as Novo Detox, Jess Ayer, who represents Caron Treatment Centers in Maryland, and James Flint J., who represents Caron Treatment Centers in Washington, D.C. and the state of Virginia. Thank you so much for attending and for participating. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.